Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members, for a really good policy discussion on very important issues for Minnesotans. Businesses are owned by people. People tend to be Minnesotans if they have a Minnesota business that we're trying to help right now in the middle of this pandemic that we still are on. I want to just make some remarks about some of the conversations that went on and my belief that getting out of this pandemic is going to take resources, Mr. President and members and Senator Bach, and that is why I supported some of the provisions that did not pass, but certainly sparks the conversation of where those resources are coming from. Getting out of this pandemic, again, is going to take resources, and we can't be cheap about it. We've heard from experts in economic sectors that say that coming out of this pandemic, we talk about and look at the past when we had the Great Recession. We underspent, if you will, on getting through a pandemic, and it took longer to get out of. My point here is that this is the time to buy the coat in the middle of the spring and the summer, or buy your straw hat in the middle of the winter. It is time for the state to invest, not to be cheap, not to constrain our opportunities of economic growth. And that is why I think it's time for us to do something more than just accept funding coming from the federal government. The federal government's bill that just passed, it's not a jobs bill, members, it's a safety net bill. And while it's greatly needed all across our communities in our state, we haven't filled the gaps that existed prior to COVID. We haven't filled those potholes. We haven't invested in broadband. Some of the funding coming will be part of that, but we're not investing in workers to the extent of propping our economy for the greater future of our state. It's great that there's some money for summer schools, but we're not investing in our schools, in our buildings, in our teachers, in our infrastructures, in our workforce. It's good that we're doing some things on broadband, like I mentioned, but we're not building, we're not retrofitting, we're not thinking about what this state could look in the future. And for me, Mr. President, I have a preferred different set of tools that I would use. Income tax is just one of them. All of these taxes are scalable. I served on taxes. It's hard to raise taxes. It's probably one of the hardest decisions you do as a lawmaker, to increase taxes. It's so much easier to cut taxes, but to do so requires courage, and it also requires identifying the need that we have in our state. And members, I've been here only 8 years. I haven't been here decades. But in my small time here, or short time here, I'm just going to share, I grew up in a community very different than the one I represent. I grew up in a community where the median income was around $17,000. Now I represent a district where the median income is over $60,000. It's a big difference. I grew up knowing where governments did not invest in the infrastructure that is so desperately needed. And when tragedy and crisis happen, it just exacerbates the gaps that were already there. And I'm certainly wanting to be part of a solution for our state, taking some votes that are hard because I know that it's desperately needed in our state to get out of this stronger for all of us, not just our businesses, but every single Minnesotan. And members, that is why I plan to support this bill, but I hope we continue the discussion about what is really necessary and needed for the state of Minnesota, not to be the outlier. Actually, we can be the outlier. We can be an example of how we get out of this pandemic stronger than any other state when we recognize what we need to do. That takes bold vision and courage from all of us to make the tough decisions that need to be made. And again, I want to recognize again that this is not a jobs bill. This is a safety net bill coming from the federal government, and we're just passing along the conformity, which is so desperately needed, but it's really going to leave us a status quo in my perspective. Members, I want to read real quickly, and I know we've been talking a lot, but I just want to share with you. You all know I have 2 little kids, 5 and 4. living through the expensive childcare, as some of us are, a lot of us are, and knowing that that industry was one of the hardest hit, and it still is the hardest hit coming out of this pandemic. A few examples highlighting the experiences of these small businesses that represent both Metro and Greater Minnesota providers. This one's about a business that received $180,000 of a PPP loan. They have 56 employees. They use the funding to keep their doors open, to pay not only our staff, rent, mortgage, utilities, but stay current on bills. If they were taxed, they would need to take out a loan or a line of credit if the bank allows it, and don't know how they would pay it otherwise. We were promised forgiveness, we followed the guidelines to a T, and we documented every penny spent. I also received a PPP loan in my small business. It is hard to document every single dollar that was attributed to these businesses that are going to have to be repaid. This person particularly says, we were in crisis before COVID. This is the childcare industry. This would just add fuel to the fire that already existed. Again, members recognizing that these issues are not going to go away with this bill. Another example is a PPP loan that received $506,000. With that, they were able to compensate all of staff and benefits of 65 employees. What would mean if you were taxed on these funds? Less money for staff raises and benefits. And the last example, a PPP loan of $304,000 for a childcare business of 40 employees. They were able to maintain staff, maintain their hours. Even when there weren't children to support the hours, we were able to keep money going to support our employees and their families. If they were taxed on this money, it would take away from our savings, and it would not only be used, they would have to get to a bank loan and to pay for other center improvements. They wouldn't be able to do those. They wouldn't be able to hire new staff, training, development, raises, and more. So members, this is just an example of an area that I truly believe, even when we pass this bill, it's still going to be in crisis. And that is why we need to look at the bigger and larger picture, the long run. What do we need for our businesses and our families to thrive? It's not just a pass-through bill. It's not just relieving them from this particular PPP loan, but it's going to take investments. And members, again, I support this bill, but it still falls short in investing in Minnesotans. Thank you, and I urge members to support the bill.